So I think that with a little bit of reflexivity, the ways in which all of us think about uncertainty have something to do with our own experiences, and both of my distinguished colleagues have already spoken about the ways in which their prior work and thinking about these subjects led to the take on uncertainty that they have now. I am in the field of science and technology studies, but I came into it not as a scientist, as Deepak introduced himself, but as a lawyer. And in STS, those of you who are familiar with the field, you will know that many people entered because they've been following the sciences or doing science at some point all of their lives. And for them, the question has been the one that David Michaels was in a way worried about, which is the production of doubt. How is it that people disagree, and why do people pull facts apart? And you see that reflected even in the name that we have given to our own particular weird age, post-truth, suggesting that we were in a state of truth before, and now we're in a state of postness about that idyllic condition that we found ourselves in. For a lawyer, I think the picture looks very different, because law is an adversarial field, and what you're trying to do is not just build up your side's case as the one that will be plausible, but to some extent tearing down the other side's case as not deserving of respect or credibility. So from the point of view of a lawyer looking at science, facts, certainty, uncertainty, whatever, the puzzle is not so much why do people disagree about facts, but why do people agree about anything? So it would be about the politics of certainty and not about the politics of uncertainty, in a sense. So the way I put it myself is what gives things stickiness? Why does anything adhere, take hold, and what do we have to say about that? And I think that Ian began with sort of situating us in the moment and why we should be thinking about these things. And it's well to remember that many of the things that we took as certain as recently as 1989 now appear extremely much in doubt. I mean, so, ever since the end of World War II, there was a sense that democracy was the wave of the world, and it was the one that was going to take over all other forms of political life. Speaking of the politics of certainty and uncertainty, there was a sense that truth was going to prevail and the Enlightenment project was going to achieve some kind of nirvana-like terminus. And yet, if you look at the governments of many of the countries that we come from, the opposite seems to be true. I mean, so all of that sort of sense that, you go back and read Kant's What is Enlightenment essay, and, the sense that we would all become sort of responsible believers in what science had shown us to be the state of the world, and then we would be able to exercise our own judgments and come to responsible decisions about ourselves and society. Well, very much the opposite seems to be what is going on. So why the unraveling, and was it the moment of certainty? How long was it anyway? It wasn't the interwar period, right? I mean, when was it? 1956? I mean, we might want to sort of do a little bit of soul searching about that as well. All right, so in STS we've developed a lot of tools, things like Harry Collins's famous work on experimenter's regress way back when in the 1980s, to look at the minutiae of how people take facts apart. I mean, what is it that makes people take those things apart? I think we've devoted less attention and interest to how they put them together, and above all to why they put them together in the first place. I mean, so this kind of play of the known and the unknown, and the sort of dyadic thing you were describing. What are the contexts in which uncertainty dies out and certainty prevails? Some of you are probably familiar with the field of public policy and since it is dominated by another field called economics, there is a great deal of certainty there. Policymakers seem to be very content to know exactly what should be done. Recently, I had a colleague of mine who's helping me teach a summer school that's forthcoming next month, say that, well, he was going to talk about nuclear energy. He didn't want to talk about nuclear waste because really we know very well what to do about nuclear waste. It's just a matter of, implementing the right solution. And I thought to myself about the politics of certainty. I mean, that is, but the fact is that if you want to give credence to another person's position and accept that that rests on a set of commitments that people really truly believe in, then it's not enough for us to smile knowingly, us in the environmentalist community broadly speaking, and sort of chuckle that anybody could think the nuclear waste problem has been solved, but rather to ask, why is this very knowledgeable person, one of the people who knows the most about anything nuclear in the world, so convinced that this is a problem that has been solved? So again, what are the sources of certainty? So I think one can, since Andy wanted me to mention co-production, I will. One can say that there is a take on the world that says that knowledge, the way we know things about the world, and norms, the way in which we think that the world should hang together, the is and the ought, that these are not separate. It is not the case that the is comes first and then people decide the ought, but that the is and the ought are mixed together in very complicated kinds of ways. If that is the case, then we can take knowledge and we can take norms and ask the stickiness question about each of them. And then come to an answer which will again, to some degree, loop me back into what Silvio and Deepak have already said. So if one looks at something like knowledge and just looks around one, reads the headlines, which coming from America, I now hesitate to do. But every day, 2 or 3 of the headlines dismiss things we all knew. I mean, so how does one do diplomacy? How does one bring a country like North Korea to heel? If you would read the newspaper headlines of the last week, you will know that it is by turning diplomacy into reality show. And maybe that works better, even though the diplomats are all crying, I mean, literally weeping at this idea that all of the norms of diplomacy have been broken. Well, what do I think? I mean, I think that there's normatively profound problems with the idea of embracing somebody who, has credible accusations of murder and, genocide against his own people raised against him, and that there's something problematic about democracy when we say that there's no difference between the one kind of regime and the other kind of regime. But that is not the same as believing in the expertise about diplomacy and what the right way to conduct diplomacy is. So you could go through many of the destabilizing things that are happening right now, and I will spare you discussions of the British side of this, though maybe we will want to come back to it at some point. Well, I figured that you have had your fill, and more so. But it is a moment that invites us to ask, where does that certainty of knowledge come from? And sitting in academia, I think we are very much involved in producing those certainties, and we have to think about that. So when something like one of the biggest prize-giving organizations in Norway bestows its most prominent Nobel-like prize on one of the makers of nudge theory, and at the same time, or months before, a similar organization in Sweden has bestowed a similar prize on the other chief organizer of nudge theory. One might ask, where does the certainty about choice architecture come from? Do these people really believe that the rationality towards which they are nudging other people does not itself rest on choice architectures? And whose job is it to investigate those choice architectures, the subliminal ones, the ones that have not been exposed, rather than the other ones? So, you know, for STS scholars, you will understand that it's convenient for us in academia to point the finger in deficit model mode at those other people who don't know as much as us. But the ways in which we know things is itself part of the undergirding of the production of certainty. And very much there is a politics of knowledge at play today, and we see it in the decimation of the humanities and the retreat of, we were talking a little bit earlier, of bookstores and libraries. I understand this august institution no longer has a library. I mean, so it is about the things we know and the things we don't know, and they're playing out on the ground in the politics of knowledge making. One can say similar things about norms, and one of the things I would like to throw out is that we know norms not because they're written down, but because they're violated. And one of the things we're seeing right now in the world at large is the extent to which we were dependent on norms. Civility is one that has been talked about. You will not find it in a constitutional order. You will not find it written down anywhere. You won't even necessarily find it in how you teach your kindergarten-age kid to say thank you. But the norms of civility we see have broken down, and what is the relationship between civility and knowledge making and democracy and politics? I mean, those are the kinds of things we should think about, and I think that the world is showing us that it is far easier to break norms than to put them back together. So for instance, it was easy enough, remarkably easy, for a president of the United States to get away with not revealing his tax returns. That was a tacit norm. It wasn't written down in law. But to create a legal engine that will force that person to release the tax records is a way more difficult proposition and way less certain than the certainty with which the norm of not disclosing the taxes was brought about. So, you know, I think that sort of dynamic is worth thinking about. So the last thing, institutions, which Deepak, you mentioned, and Silvio, you obviously tacitly also mentioned, a place where things get sorted out, where we arrive at the balancing of knowledge and norms and end up saying what is certain or uncertain, is institutions of different sorts. So each one of these has its own dynamics. You can think about law and law courts as being institutions that are in the business of producing certainties of different sorts. And I think throughout the course of these days, it'll be interesting for us to think about which institutions we credit and which ones we defend, because of the point that Silvio made. What is a good certainty, and what is a good and what is a bad certainty or uncertainty, as the case may be. So what is the role of powerful institutions in channeling certainty and uncertainty, both of them, towards the good as opposed to the bad? And then, of course, where do our standards for the good and the bad come from? So I'll stop with that.